Hello everyone, today we talk once again about the concept of Middle Ages, because the legitimate question here is, what the hell are we talking about? I mean, you know that on Schwerpunkt for now I've been, essentially talking very frequently about medieval history. My strategy is essentially now to talk a lot about it, to form this solid base of videos that eventually and hopefully will get the channel kind of started. For me, it's naturally easy to talk about medieval times because I spent last years of my life studying it. So at least I have some opinion that can, at least I can't say it's valuable because that's just up to you to decide. But it can be useful in some way, even to think the Middle Ages indeed. And objectively, this is the point. When we talk about the Middle Ages, and we said it many times, we really do not talk about anything real, concrete. You can legitimately go out there and claim that the medieval times never existed, because objectively, the Middle Ages never existed. And I'm not talking about the definition in itself, because many people say, I don't know, it was just the humanists who were in the Renaissance that began to say, medieval times is sort of a contemporary definition for saying that, this was a kind of a non-age, a sort of thing that is defined only because it was in between certain true ages and seemingly nothing, interesting or important happening there. Because the point is, it really goes beyond, because the point is, medieval times did not exist as such proper, not even as an objective time in history, in terms of of common elements in these times and spaces that made this a unique thing. It's just like a construction, and we get tricked all the time. I mean, I believe, especially if you're born like in our world now, and I can say in the West, because we will see now that also the concept of Middle Ages is strongly rooted in Western perspective in itself, and how we looked at our own world, and we decided to organize in this fashion. In other continents, it's not really like that. But the point I'm making, I guess, is that we, even by recognizing that no medieval time ever existed, we still think it. At least for me, it happens really in this way. When I hear the word Middle Ages, I automatically, in my mind, there are certain pictures and feelings and ideas and thoughts and emotions that are connected to this kind of stereotypical time in history that even studying it hasn't really helped. Not because when we go studying there, we objectively study in courses and that are called medieval history or something like that, but it's simply because we have grown, we have, as kids at school, in our families, the idea that it was a medieval time, and that medieval time had those characters and those characteristics. So today, I will try to rather not really explaining how this is not true, really. Of course, yeah, kind of half of the video will be by reflection, indirectly dedicated to this, but I will try essentially to list also the element, the prejudices that brought us to conceive the Middle Ages as such. Also, this is not going to be a list of prejudices, of cliches and things, but it's more than else a look at our own thoughts of the medieval times, and in order to understand them better and to frame them into a more realistic and more rationalizing essentially the irrational we associate to the Middle Ages in many ways, in both ways, because also in here, when people try to, it happens also to me as a medievalist. I try to usually always, my narrative tends to highlight naturally I can say the positive aspects of medieval times, but I try to stress certain continuities or certain aspects of medieval times that objectively I show not differing substantially, essentially talking about a pre-industrial society from the ones of, I don't know, the ancient times, especially the early modern age, and so on, because that's quite useful also to make us understand what, how there is no real barrier even between the ancient times and modern age objectively. And there are people out there who will absolutely claim, I've heard actually countless figures, personalities, characters that also are known for their culture, for their education, for their who actually have a narrative of history that really defines medieval times as such, and very often also in kind of negative times. There is always some kind of progressist out there who has to say that essentially medieval times were a moment of regression, which is absolutely false, because if there was any regression, it mostly happened in, also in here it's very difficult to use these terms, but aside the very first centuries of the Middle Ages, that in some countries lasted only like 150 years, medieval times were continuous progress. There is no historical doubt about this. Now we should understand naturally what is progress, what is regression, if you want, but this is not the point. The point I'm making is that such conception is so still deeply rooted in our world that we're still not able to reason without, which for many other preconceptions, etc., it's something we manage to overcome in many ways. The prejudices on Middle Ages are really hard to die, and I don't really know when we will ever get rid of it. Perhaps because it's as if we will see it later. The medieval times seem to be a sort of an alibi for other ages, like saying, we need the dark, bad thing, whatever it is in our life, to compare it with other brighter events, and it doesn't really make sense because it's not a realistic assessment. But I say that what we loaded the Middle Ages with is essentially a negative picture that it kind of recurs. There is especially this progressist, I can't say even positivistic conception, because also in there positivism looked at medieval times in very ambivalent ways, depending on which times in the Middle Ages. So that actually brought it to another stage was also incorrect. But the idea of progress in itself, the inherent prejudice that exists in the Western world, that the world has teleologically to grow and to increase in quality, but obviously this goes up, and there are ups and downs in the process, and every down is essentially a new Middle Ages in some form. That's probably the most terrifying, one of the most terrifying historical conceptions that, by the way, in my opinion, hides an incredible violence, conceptually speaking. The idea that there is an entire time in history that is essentially inherently negative, and you need to hate and to despise. It's absurd. It's as if you hated the whole humanity that lived in and its accomplishment into those ages because you're complexed about something, because I believe this is ultimately the reason. No time in history has been easy, definitely, and it's as if we had to justify what we are doing on the basis of saying, look, that was the dark period, that was really the moment in where everything was bad, everyone was oppressed, everything was, there was no rule, it was such an obscure time, everybody was poor, a terrible thing. I believe that, when we will study the 20th century in history, that will probably be, if anything, the darkest time in history in many ways, considering the way we were able to wipe out hundreds of millions, which is something that really, in previous times never existed in such a short time and with such a direct intent, actually. So, excuse me, I drank a little before we go on. So, yet we are in this time in history. We are in 2019, and at this point, we still, in our studies and either in schools or universities, we have the Middle Ages still conceptually. So this is a naturally a long. It's a historical profile that goes on a very long period, as I understand, and that, as we know, is defined as this Middle Age. So this median age, I don't know how you want to consider it. That it's really characterized, in fact, by two essentially criteria. The first one is a chronological one. We identified medieval times in a time length, essentially. On the other, in the other way, we identified it in a thematical and critical way, for which we tend to characterize medieval times with this fashion throughout this time. And calling, however, medieval times a historical period is by itself kind of wrong, or at least it's very reducing, let's say, and both for the first of all, as we were saying before, medieval times are mostly a European and the European derived, so essentially Western perspective, because naturally this was, when we study Middle Ages, we essentially, for instance, on Schwerpunkt, I cover mostly European history, but also Mediterranean history, very often Near and Middle Eastern history, because and also this would be it is very complex to explain. Maybe in another video we will focus better on why exactly it is there, but it's still obvious, and to make one of the reasons is objectively that Europe was massively influenced by whatever happened in the Mediterranean and in the Near and Middle East, not just in medieval times, but also in ancient, and for the greatest part actually also in modern and in contemporary times. So, but the point of view, the perspective is always European, and I would say sometimes even more narrow than that. And you can notice in Schwerpunkt, because I mostly talk about Western European history. That is, it's not really a pity. I try to extend talking a bit about the Byzantines, and I'm very happy when I can talk about Eastern Europe as well. And even Northern Europe is probably not that studied objectively. I mean, medieval times really focus on this kind of Western world of narrowly meant, even sometimes. I've talked many times about the giant complex, for instance. That is the idea, in my opinion, that it's much easier for a person living in the 21st century to be polarized in its attention towards the great national monarchies, for instance, and leaving aside other political forms like, I don't know, city republics or other. And so we generally concentrate in medieval times. Also iconography. Look at pop culture. Pop culture today is mostly, say, Anglo-Saxon dominated. So most of what we see actually in television and on the internet, etc., is even visually something that is usually about 15th century England. When we look at medieval times, even think about the houses, think about the clothes, think about even the weather. This idea that intrinsically in medieval times the weather had to be always gloomy or something like that. These are kind of a cliche, but objectively can kind of look at it in perspective and look at the incidence of how we focus on that vision, even that visual approach, what medieval times really were. I think when you look especially British produced fiction, you realize, even certain contexts that maybe are fantasy, that medieval times gave, inspired also many fantasy and pretty strangely, and we will see that even later, settings. I think it was like, if you look at the first season of the Game of Thrones, I was looking at a video the other day, you realize that I think it's set in a completely fantasy scenario, but that's simply, a kind of a odd, stereotypical idea of what, in outlook, at least of what medieval England in, I don't know, late medieval times should essentially was. And that's, you realize that even in certain, this doesn't just happen in Britain, it happens in many other countries, that obviously we all think about our history in a way that naturally is functional to us. I mean, having the same periodizations in history. There are countries who have different periodizations. Guess why? Because their histories were kind of different, and there were certain things that happened more and happened less. For instance, from the Anglo-Saxon perspective, the medieval times have been longer because the Renaissance kind of started later. There are many. Okay, let's skip this because maybe it's not so important. But also in here, the individual perception is really important eventually for the narrative that you want to stress. But so we have to understand that this is really the point, that the main this stereographical characterization we gave to the medieval times is essentially an intellectual and cultural product of the period comprehended between the 18th and the 20th century. So this is crucial to understand. I mean, mostly, we are tricked by our own mind. We don't have really a impartial view of medieval times. Today, naturally, in historiography, we arrived at a point in which we are kind of the most advanced level ever reached of objectivity, of accuracy that has ever existed in history towards kind of every age. Medieval times are relatively easy to cover, differently from contemporary age, not just because we're still living in the contemporary age, but chiefly because nobody can dominate contemporary sources. Medieval sources can't be dominated either, but if you really study them for a lifetime, you can start having a kind of a good point sometimes when you look at the broader perspective and you can formulate certain conceptions. But really, the way, and even in pop culture, especially in pop culture, what we look at the Middle Ages through is essentially the lenses of our societies from the Enlightenment onwards. So through the eyes of a historical phase that has been naturally fundamental in the elaboration of today's world and its values in many ways. Naturally, this can be properly criticized because I believe that our world and our values of, for instance, much more than we think to the same medieval times than we actually really want to look at. There is a kind of, also in here, progressist idea that it's somewhat our civilization emerged only from the Enlightenment, but it's evidently not the case, I believe. Not just because the 18th century really reformulate. If you look at in the perspective of the history of philosophy, for instance, everything that's been formulated in the 18th century already existed in Nietzsche essentially in the 17th. First of all, that was, by the way, a very religiously, 17th century was the century of the sound of Maine, at least one of the centuries, let's say, of the main religious clashes. It was a highly spiritual world, and in many ways, concept of equality, of tolerance stemmed from that same world. But also from many other times. I mean, the same concept of spirituality, of universalism, is something you find even in medieval times, and in certain cases even earlier than that. And therefore also the point I'm making, I guess, is that still, however, the way we look at medieval times is disproportionately more influenced by the historiography of the from the 18th to the 20th century than actually what was thought and believed before. Which is kind of interesting because the historiography of these centuries has been very strongly oriented from an ideological point of view. And we perhaps got finally rid of this very strong bias towards history just in the very last generations, for which we start looking at history in a kind of a more really multidimensional way that's not really interested in setting a narrative, but in really kind of, if anything, tearing it down and looking at the whole thing as an extraordinarily complex system that is objectively very difficult, first of all, even to analyze, and practically impossible to even understand, because we don't, let's face it, we don't really know what medieval times were. We don't. I mean, we know a freaking lot of things about them, but definitely the things we don't know exceed, at least for even what we are interested in today, that is essentially the mindset in many ways. But this is also another consideration we have to skip for now, at least. So the term Middle Ages also, as such, is although people really do not much about medieval times at all, it's a term that is really used out there. It's very frequently used in our everyday life, if you think about it. Not only by, the average person, even the person, in fact, that knows very few about history, but also by the mass media, for instance. So radio, television, newspapers, and also talking about of course, also the internet as such, but also in there things are more complicated, and I would like to scope them more in depth in a dedicated video. And what is, I think, heartbreaking about the use of the word, the usage of the word Middle Ages, is its negative and polemical acception. Essentially, medieval times are conceived as a sort of, in this common use, as a sort of repugnant phase of our history in terms of civil customs, or this is a medieval thing. We have gone back to the Middle Ages, as if the Middle Ages were really the doom. You never say we go back to, I don't know, 3rd century Rome. No, we have to go back to medieval times to reach, I don't know, something that was. We didn't go back to the Holocaust. No, we have to go back to medieval times, because we all know that medieval times are, the most terrible phase. Is so dark, so terrible, so gloomy, where people were also extremely ignorant, and they were so oppressed and intolerant, and were living in the dark ages. Oh my God, what a terrible thing, because no time in history was so terrible as the Dark Ages. That's essentially the idea. The Dark Ages, everything was, the most instinctive and brutal and violent forces were unleashed in there. People were, the earth was scorched by every possible disease, it was such a terrible one. This is really the idea, and what is interesting here, it's really semantics. It's really what we associate, this vocabulary that is so deeply rooted in our way of thinking that even by just saying Middle Ages, we can evoke this very weird concept. For me, when I hear the Middle Ages, it might sound strange. I have a very strongly visual imagination. For me, I often associate colors to words, to when I hear medieval times, maybe it's not interesting for you, but I imagine a kind of a sort of blue/violet color, and I don't know why. It's because partly it's the idea of the gloomy thing that comes back. I think the also certain centuries in medieval times are, to me, are kind of either dark or light. In my mind, instinctively, it's not something I'm thinking about. It's really something very sensorial, and I imagine medieval times as sort of there's something magic attached to it. I mean, something exoteric, something mystical. I I imagine it, even especially in my language, as I pronounce, as I spell the name. And however, it gives me some sort of propositive, ideal. When I think the Middle Ages, I think something. In English, it doesn't give me the same impression, for instance, but it makes me feel as if this was actually a moment of great moral commitment, of something that was dynamic, something that was expanding, but still I have certain even there is some audio effect to it, as if the I don't know even how to say this, and there was a bit of a softening, a deadening of sounds when I say word Middle Ages. I don't know why. So it's as if it was a bit of an enchanted phase in history. Something strange, something mysterious, something that you can't. Something irrational. Yeah, probably that's the sensation I get when I hear the word. So you see, and try to maybe, I don't know, just tell me how you see it like, if you have this kind of emotions when you pronounce certain words. And I have so many different impressions also when I, discuss every other parts of medieval times. I mean, other subdivisions of medieval times. I have such very strongly sensorial experiences. On the other hand, so there is this kind of, however, negative idea in pop culture that we attribute to the Middle Ages, or even to the term Byzantine. Byzantine is also used pretty much like that. Something schemy, something really has to do with plots, with sort of Machiavellic idea. Also, the same Machiavellic term is kind of a cliche that is still used, and people don't really understand even why this was. Machiavellic seems to be now a concept of a person who is that is plotting always something, and that is so cunning and intricate and diabolic in the way it was conceived. But as a matter of fact, Machiavelli's idea was something completely different. On the contrary, it was something extremely direct and pragmatic and and evident, that didn't have to hide anything. I mean, obviously, it shows a new form of politics that was not so open at that point, according to the principles of Christianity. It could be also something more cunning, but it's it was really based on more of a sort of realpolitik ideal, that rather something so necessarily plotting or diabolical in itself. I mean, of course, well, now it's complicated. I don't know why I started to think about Machiavelli in itself, but Machiavelli was still framed into a sort of Christian ideal. He said, essentially, you can't even go against religion if you have to do well to the state, because that can cause a greater good sometimes. So that's interesting. But in fact, with Machiavelli, we are already out of medieval times. As we think about it, we are in the Renaissance, in the modern age, in a new way of thinking. So it would be interesting to know whether this was objectively so different. But in part, yes. I mean, I like to stress Machiavelli's thought as a kind of a turning point. And this is it. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. On the other hand, there are also positive, and I would say excessively positive, thoughts about medieval times. As we were saying before, I'm not here to impose a narrative for which medieval times were worse, but not even better necessarily than other periods. There were simply medieval times. There is no. You have to look at the context in any case and really understanding what it follows historically. On the basis of that context, then the periodization is not so important overall. And most of the positive prejudices towards medieval times came from always the same period in history in the last centuries, and more specifically the 19th century, in the so-called Romantic era, which tended to reevaluate medieval times. Also, it really depends. At that point was mostly a national-driven prejudice. I mean, the idea was that the forming nation states in many countries were looking at medieval times as essentially as the moment in where their national conscience and unity had been born, naturally being mistaken in great part because indeed what happened in medieval times brought eventually to develop what would have become essentially the true sort of proto-nation, the nations that were emerging in those years. But at that point, the real problem is not really that continuity, but really how you conceive the idea of nation in itself. So it's really complicated. But aside from this, the medieval times were revived and reevaluated in certain aspects that were very often also generalized to the world age, or were kind of over hyper emphasized in some fashion, and therefore we remember medieval times as, for instance, the time of these great accomplishments, such as the building of cathedrals and of the great schools of thought, of the scholastics, the age that produced Giotto or Dante. But on the other hand, also from a religious point of view, we remember the medieval times like the age of religious faith, also of chivalric heroism, of the freedom of fantasy, and of the feelings, and of love as well. So these are all verified. This is our prejudices that I like, telling the truth. I objectively, I'm not an impartial person myself. I'm biased myself. I love to think about medieval times as the times of what I've just listed, not because I'm particularly attached to any of these perspectives at all. Of course I can, and I often criticize them in many ways, but it's still let's say a more positive view you can have for medieval times. So if you really want to make people understand it, you should start from. I mean, if you really have to start from a prejudice, it's better that if you start from a positive prejudice rather than to a negative one, because it at least takes you closer and at least more say faster. It takes you faster also into knowing more about this period, because if you really despise it, most likely you're not even going to be interested in it. And generally speaking, from a psychological point of view, people always despise what they do not know. We are programmed as apes to really, everything that we see something new, it's until we don't understand it, it's something scary. So as long as we don't understand it, it must stay away. Then we will eventually figure out, but it's a potential threat, something that can mess up our hunter-gatherer society, and let's leave it aside. But once you get to know medieval times and you get these narratives, you are perhaps more interested, definitely, at least to know more. And for instance, I personally started to study medieval times as a temporary activity. I didn't want to study medieval times. I liked an ancient era. And my idea was to essentially progress in those years of university and to eventually study a bit of both. Now, I don't explain because there were bureaucratic problems. I couldn't basically study the ancient history. Besides, I can't speak ancient Greek, so that's a problem. With Latin, fortunately, I studied it for 8 years. I kind of have, I'm fine. But also studying the ancient history without knowing ancient Greek proper, at least, yeah, of course I can't pick up a vocabulary and translate something, but and eventually along the way, so I started actually having from a negative prejudice of the medieval times. It wasn't completely negative at all. It was I had kind of mixed feelings because when I was a kid, I actually loved the Middle Ages. I was extremely I collected so many toy soldiers, were the medieval times. I liked the period. I was passionate about so many things. But going on, especially my teen age, I started liking other phases in history. Also, yeah, I also loved Roman times, and I kind of revived the interest into that. I also started to learn about. I liked also modern contemporary literature and so on. So medieval time, the interest toward the Middle Ages was kind of the ancient love, but now I thought that I had grown, that I had changed. So when I started university, I really didn't want to study it. I mean, I wanted to know more about it, of course, but I didn't want to make a living out of it. Then it turns out, the more I began to study it, the more I studied it eventually, the more I realized how so many prejudices in fact we have, which doesn't mean to say because we are also pretty weird in the way we use word. When you say prejudice in our world that is obsessed by every form of possible imaginable discrimination, which is also a neutral term, you immediately have to give a color to prejudice. That saying prejudice has always to be a negative prejudice. Prejudices can be also positive. The problem is that they are prejudices, which means that you judge something before knowing it. That is really where the problem stands. Like discrimination, there can be a positive or negative discrimination, but discrimination now is basically equates to racism in some way. So this is how also we are raping our vocabulary. And looking at medieval times, I realized, looking at medieval times in depth, how, it's as if we had a filter. That's when you're able to take it off or to go through it, and you look at really how, from the sources, how this was, you realize that all these myths that have been told, they're in fact myths. And you're living in a society that still has these myths because that society simply doesn't know that there is that filter out there. It's like Plato's cave. That's literally the same thing. And it doesn't came, however, through such a solemn enlightenment for which, now I know how the Middle Ages really were. No, nobody knows. But from what we know from these sources, we objectively see that all these ideological constructions that have brought to a real obsession of our civilization towards the Middle Ages in one or in another are kind of useless. And the beauty of any age in history, really any age, is exactly looking at it without those filters if you can. Now the real problem is that you have to spend a lot of resources in order to take away those filters. I mean, it's as if our own society created an automatic filter that towards these times that obviously brings to a very high attrition to get rid of. So it's as if our own culture kind of poisoned itself by creating these stereotypes that objectively are useless, and simply because they didn't look at history in an objective way, but they indulge in their own fantasies to push their narratives, their political agendas, and so on. And this keeps going on, by the way, because if you look at how history is still used partly in our, I don't know, for instance, in our political debate, you realize that it's really instrumentalized, for which history is not important to learn or to understand. It's simply used to say, okay, look at that time in history, that evil guy did that evil thing, and therefore, I don't know, we should make something now because of that. Even if nobody is related to that person anymore, nobody really cares. But I don't know. This is, and there is no particular reference to something else. I mean, it could be a person, could be a phenomenon some way. So, but this still goes on, and it goes on pretty consistently. So you're also wondering what we will get to. When is that the masses will have true scholarization, through schooling, let's say better in English, at least very clear in mind that when we look at history we have to be objective, and every kind of subjective interpretation is not history. Of course history is subjective, of course it is, at the same time, but at least acknowledging that, we'll look at the medieval times, for instance, in a way that basically has almost nothing to do with historical, what we know from real history. So it's kind of interesting because it poses so many problems also in our lives. I think that if we manage to get rid of prejudices on any time, any period in history, we would be a consistently better society from a civical point of view, because having achieved that basically equates to have reached a certain level of intellectual maturity for which you don't just invent things at your own consumption for your interests and closing your eyes in front of evidence, but you're able to assess something on the base of sources of evidence and what it takes. And you can use this method in any other part of your life. But it's still weird because there are many people who get educated to study on the base of evidence who still have prejudices towards medieval times. I mean, even that given there is this never-ending, I can't say hostility, but kind of picking one another, in terms of those people who study the so-called humanistic subjects, which is also a disgusting term, by the way, but study the humanities and so on, and those who study the scientific world. And objectively, we tend to say usually that people who study scientific subjects are kind of more intelligent than the average. And personally and honestly, I believe this is, tendentially by education, I think, I personally believe it is true, on average. I don't think there is a consistent, massive difference objectively, but I believe that studying scientific subjects is really a much faster accelerator for intelligence, because in there it really teaches you in a brutal way, with a brutal scientific method, that what is right, what is wrong, what is real, what is false, essentially. In humanities there are a lot of crazies and weirdos, but this happens incidentally also in these scientific subjects, and it's actually full of extremists also among people who study science. For me, there should be no division. People should be taught since school times to study humanities and scientific subjects at the same level. Point. And I believe that anyone who believes that the two things have to be distinguished is essentially a stupid person. And if you don't have the two things, you can't be a complete human being. You have to arrive to dominate the essentials, the elementary elements, the elementary notions of both the spheres. But sometimes you speak with these I don't know, scientists, people who have we're reasonable people who are actually quite intelligent. they have such good positive ideas and so on. Then they get to medieval times, you see, that was a time of darkness and oppression. What about now? So you realize that even people were taught a very good fact-checking, scientific, we have a method and we have a scientific mindset, still when it comes to history, they don't really understand what it's really about. And that's also another problem, because objectively, when you're taught through a kind of a I don't know what's the term in English, when you're taught a kind of an exact, let's say, kind of a exact, precise science, there is not much criticism left. I mean, history technically is a science in itself, but obviously it's not an exact science. And the greatness of history is that when you look at it, you have no way to check whether things were true, but through your criticism. So this doesn't mean that, there is a part of subjectivity that enters into play, of course, and there is no way to fact check things, but at the same time there is a community out there that discusses these things and looks at perspectives broadly, and paradoxically it's this lack of exact points of reference that brings you to essentially formulate something that has to be more reliable out of nothing, and therefore setting certain, at least creating a narrative that takes at least to take into consideration realistically what really happened there, even if you don't clearly know. So also in here, pros and cons from humanities and science that should really mingle together. For instance, I'm a great advocate. I have much more of a scientific mindset, I think, than a humanistic one. And I'm actually very proud of this, because I tend to look at history not just from a humanistic point of view, like most of the people do out there, I believe, also in the academies. But I always try to insert some kind of technical aspect into it. I mean, for me, even things like physics, like history of technology, of economics, they are really important. You can't interpret history just as a history of thoughts and of ideas. You have also to look at the solid. You have to understand how reality works. Many people who start studying history, it's because they hate maths, for instance. I also sucked at maths usually, so it's part of the reason why I started studying history too. But that's not the point. I didn't suck at maths enough to understand that you can't exclude the scientific understanding of the world when you study history. If you think to study history, if you really don't know maths, or if you don't know geography, or you think that technology is only, but don't study history, it's useless. May go another job, study philosophy or something. This was a bad joke. I'm sorry for all the philosophers who follow me, but that's for instance, I love philosophy, but I realized I could have never studied at university because of this. Because I believe that history, in all its complexity and in its complication, is still, however, fact-based. Philosophy is, there are many intersections, of course. I mean, philosophy is necessary to learn history, for instance. Also, if you think that philosophy is useless, don't study history because you don't know what you're talking about. But at the same time, this is really me. It's not a criticism towards philosophy, but philosophy is the history of ideas, if you want. And that is great. It makes you reason in many ways, but I still need certainties. First of all, I don't like much to study what other people's opinions were. So perhaps this is what shifted me towards another. I mean, I like to understand them, but not to follow them. So I thought I could have never fall in love with a particular author. That's something that I despise. If I couldn't. Not even as an historian, I care much about historiography and authors and so on. I appreciate them. I can evaluate them if they're clever, if they say something that helps me understanding better history, but they're not the aim. For many people, instead, if you don't don't have someone to follow, they kind of panic. But well, history is really something you can go look at the source and say, okay, now that's really the source in me, because that's really how it is. I mean, you have people who might have written oceans of ink on a certain topic, but still the relation that you can have with the source is your own, and the source is the base. It can be faulted, it can be obviously the source might not state the truth. Most of the time, it never actually can argue philosophically that sources are never true. They never state the truth. They never give you a real information. If not, in the way you can basically look at it and observe it and take it as an historical datum, as historical evidence. So I like very much this idea of digging into the sources to really say, okay, what's the general picture we get from this? What do really these sources tell us? It's kind of interesting. I know many people would find this boring, but for me, for instance, it's kind of everything in this job, and I like it because it never ends. And this is also another very interesting part of it, that history is a continuous renewal of it's a continuous reconsideration, basically, of your own ideas, and without a pattern. So you're really out there on your own, and you decide what to do of this. Excuse me, I drink once again. So the final point of the foremost reflection on the on the perception of medieval times, as either positive or negative era, is very important because it poses the question: why do we argue essentially about the Middle Ages in these terms, while we don't do the same thing with other historical periods that, in fact, were nor better nor worse, as we've seen. I mean, this is really a thing, because how many people do you find that really discuss the true nature of, I don't know, ancient times, modern times, or contemporary times? Of course, there is a lot of criticism, like, there is also in this progressivist thought, the idea, which was the moment of greatest development of civilization. Where did our values stem from? Was this a kind of a good era? Especially recently, there are people saying, I don't know, there are so many negative things that happened in this period, so we shouldn't study it. Kind of an idiotic thought. I know actually many people were convinced of this, and I avoid them, of course. But nobody actually discusses other eras like the way we do for the Middle Ages. We never question whether it was such a dark, terrible period. We don't really even care on average. So it's very difficult to answer the why at this point. We can maybe set up a kind of certain points. At least if we want to, at least to try to get a correct answer. So the first consideration you can make is that, as we were saying before, the concept of Middle Ages belongs exclusively to the Euro/Mediterranean West. And therefore medieval times from this perspective can only metaphorically and I don't even know how to say that, only metaphorically and shiftedly be adapted to other geo-historical contexts, which we do, because we often talk about, I don't know, the Indian Middle Ages, the Chinese Middle Ages. We have kind of something like that. And in my opinion, however, it's not entirely false or entirely wrong, because I do believe that, at least if you look at the Eurasian continent, that is the one that I know was history I know kind of best, but perhaps just North Africa in its. But there are certain common patterns. I mean, even in the same Europe, if you look at the division between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, yeah, there were so many differences, but at the same time we're still pretty homogeneous. I mean, there were more things they had in common in absolute terms that they didn't. And the same trends, this contraction of and shrinking of society at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and then this revival around the High Middle Ages, and then the Black Death, and then the regrowth toward the Late Middle Ages, is something that, if you look at least the whole Eurasian continent, North Africa, at least where there were the most developed civilizations, they kind of go in towards the same direction. There were not excessive differences, in my opinion. I realize that this opinion can be profitably criticized, but nevertheless, I've been stricken, observing that other history other than the Western European was how actually close such transcontinental dynamics really were to all of these areas. I mean, it's really incredible. I mean, the brightest example that you can do, because objectively it was not a great difference at all, is the same. You look at the history of the Byzantine Empire. After all, there was really nothing so different was happening compared to Western Europe, aside from the political and institutional forms. I mean, the moments of expansion and contraction were essentially the same. Same goes if you extend to the Near East. It was substantially similar. So aside from the obvious contexts and influences that were out there, were pretty intense. But even at a structural level, these systems had kind of similar histories at this point. However, in general, it's the same concept of Middle Ages that can be questioned, especially from a cultural point of view in the rest of the world, out of the West. So that at this point, the most interesting thing would be asking, I don't know, a Chinese what he or she thinks about that age, how they look at the world at that point. What's their periodization like? What about an Indian? Even probably an Indian has been influenced by the kind of Western historiography at this point pretty intensely. And looking at these perspectives and trying to understand what is that, was there kind of Middle Ages, and can we kind of think of it in some way? It's quite difficult. Because, it's good to be an iconoclast. It's good to say, okay, let's now tear down every kind of periodization, but at the same time you should ask yourself, in spite of the ideology that was behind this periodization in these recent times, in recent centuries in history, is there actually something concrete? Because through my personal experience, I believe that when you go read, I don't know, these great 19th century authors that were definitely BS. They had either a very strong national or a strong religious or kind of an ideological point of view, but at the same time, if you read what they were observing, you realize that, they weren't that wrong for most of what they were writing. So medieval times are a product of our imagination, but still there are certain phenomena that are kind of certain patterns you can apply to it that are kind of interesting, because they they're largely fitting in some way, but whatever. The second point is is exactly what we were getting at now. The idea that medieval times do not really come from a strictly historically objective evidence, but they essentially were created by a series of cultural choices, if you want. So there is not a real unity of medieval times, for instance. Is also a very important point. I mean, the Middle Ages are extremely diverse, but and their perception really varied together with the historiographical or ideological attitudes of who considers this period, as we have seen. The third point is that it's objectively impossible to seriously deal with in the same way, with the whole Middle Ages. Because if you only take it from a chronological point of view, it's very, very long. Objectively, it starts from the 4th, 8th century to the 14th, 16th century. There are also other, perceptions that are. There are also other timelines. There are people who believe that, the Middle Ages can start even from the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Others will make it arrive up to the 18th century. So also these are very kind of ideological points of view. If you ask me, really, one is that, since we like military history, I have my own idea personally. That is, if we really want to identify medieval warfare from any point of view, we have to look at politics and society, because that's the only way you can look at the military. And objectively, obviously there was nothing like a medieval warfare, but if we really have to proceed by approximation, probably medieval warfare stopped in the 20th century. Medieval warfare as a product of a certain politics and society stopped when the Second Reich, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Tsarist Russia finished. That's in my opinion what you can make that point. I mean, it's an approximation, but it's kind of real and important to define. If you look at the political and social structures, that there is much to support this interpretation in many ways. So when talking about the Middle Ages, we're talking about essentially a millennium of history, or more or less, let's say, according at least to the classical vision of medieval times. So from 7 to 15 centuries, basically, considering others, and the criteria can really be very, very different, because also in here, how can you do it? Really, throughout this millennium roughly, you have a great change into the institutions, social structures, living conditions, territorial assets, ways to consider the world. So, and these changes were very deep and all over Europe. So therefore it's very difficult, when not actually dangerous, to talk about something that is absolutely medieval. That's really something you don't have to do if you really want to be honest with yourself. You can and you should exercise your mind, saying, let's take some relative aspects of medieval times and let's try to see how where I can interpret that millennium through this pattern or not. But you should know that when you try to identify seriously from an absolute point of view something that is strictly medieval, well, if you do, you're wrong. There are no many ways out of it. So the great risk when talking about medieval times as an absolute time, let's say, is to generalize certain concepts and problems that in reality really do not belong to the whole Middle Ages, but just to a phase of it, or at least a specific aspect of its dynamic course. Or either to a way of conceiving it, rather, which are actually the same, the different faces of the same coin. So, looking at these 3 points, we can make some further consideration. First of all, this same term, Middle Ages, that is the media aetas, so this era that lays in the middle of something else, is definitely already a very terrible concept in itself. It's a sort of diaphragm or kind of a bridge, a link connection to a previous and a following time that is perceived as something as well distinguishable and owning a certain intimate homogeneity that makes it so clearly out there, and that basically creates this space in the middle. What is worse of this is that medieval times in this sense do not really just appear as a vacuum between these two eras, but they also work as a connection. So they are not even something that have the dignity of an age of its own that can, claim, I'm here, I'm equally important to the others. No, it's actually subservient to the connection of the other two eras. So this is the terrible humanistic conception of medieval times. I'm not really sure. I don't think the humanists really conceived this kind of a necessity, if not in a Christian way, meaning that the Christian conception was chronologically oriented. So it was kind of God's will that the Middle Ages had happened, but at the same time, the humanists were also quite really snobbish towards the same Middle Ages, so they didn't probably give them this kind of functional importance. They simply said, okay, this was an accident in the path along the way. We kind of went down for some reason, so whatever happened in here is kind of not important. Let's restart it now on the wake of the Greek-Roman civilization, and now we are in the Renaissance, in the modern age in some way, and let's go on. So, also in here, the Renaissance is a key word, in fact, and I've made some video at this point on the Renaissance and this kind of conception. I expressed also my personal opinions about what I feel towards the Renaissance. And I really like the Renaissance. I mean, I'm not... even as a medievalist, I don't really despise the Renaissance at all. On the contrary, I think that the Renaissance is being so great thanks to the Middle Ages, because what also people think is the same Renaissance prejudice of having of the Renaissance having been sort of passive recovery of the ancient classical knowledge, but this is absolutely false. Whoever knows Renaissance art and literature and technology and so on perfectly knows that the Renaissance is way more than that. The good Renaissance was essentially an original synthesis and even an improvement of the ancient world. I mean, the Renaissance, they didn't know that at the time. The Renaissance was already much far ahead as a civilization than the classical one. It was already more advanced. At that point, they didn't have a clear understanding of this because they didn't quite get certain. But it's evident they were already more advanced as a system in so many ways. These conceptions, although are so by the way, these concepts are not really even the same concept of Renaissance was not thought at the time, because the Middle Ages as a term have a humanistic origin, but the Renaissance is a term that came into use during the Romanticism. So also in here, the same Renaissance people didn't consider themselves as Renaissance people. And so it would be also interesting to really see what all the people in the Renaissance really thought it, because also in here we fall in the trick of our most recent historiography. I mean, the one that developed from the 18th century on to the 20th, that basically attributed to the Renaissance a perception that it wasn't really that really didn't exist at the time, because most Renaissance geniuses and polymaths, etc., yeah, of course they were inspired to ancient models, but I think they were kind of aware that first of all, many of them were kind of pragmatically oriented. I mean, it was really mostly the humanists who stressed the classicist legacy, also for aesthetical reasons, for political propaganda and so on. Well, whereas if you look at especially certain artists that were essentially craftsmen, were people who lived at the contact with technology, with the practice, etc., you realize that they were probably not so dogmatic, not so fanatic towards classical times like we might believe, and ultimately it was really most about them and not humanists as such that we have the Renaissance in many ways. At this point, I've made several videos about the Renaissance, about even many aspects of military engineering, sculptures, and so on, that you realize that in there was a genius that was developing from a very dynamic and open mind set that couldn't really just stick to a mostly philological recovery of the classics. The Renaissance was not born because of the recovery of the classics. The Renaissance was born out of the development of medieval society. And this is also a very difficult concept to make people understand. I mean, I think literally the majority of people out there truly believes in the childish notion that the Renaissance emerged because someone began to read classical texts. This is not really how it worked. I mean, the Renaissance was already started in order for people to take those books. So this is really important to understand. Also, you have to understand that the Middle Ages without the Renaissance, basically, from an historiographical point of view, conceptually speaking, really do not have much of a sense. First of all, there are two concepts that, as we've seen, are referred essentially to the history of the West, and everything was kind of stemming from the ancient repartitions of Western culture in many ways. I mean, the idea was conceived already like this at the time, that the area that more or less belonged to the pars occidentes of Roman Empire, so that the one that basically was definitely split from the time of Theodosius at the end of the 4th century, was kind of a falling apart because Greek-Roman culture was kind of stopped at that point. The imperial institution collapsed, and in the east instead you have the Byzantine Empire that is born from the Pars Orientis and that of the Theodosian repartition, which represents in theory a perfect continuation of that culture and those institutions. Now the problem is that when during the 15th and 16th century, this is really what the concept of Renaissance stems from, is that the Greek-Roman culture apparently was reborn into Western Europe. So this is really the point. That's what the Renaissance is really about. Because at the same time, this was not happening in the East. Because, this is the difference in potentials. Of course, during the 15th and 16th century now, the eastern part was being conquered by the Ottomans. But the real point is that the Eastern Roman world at that point didn't have, theoretically, this is the view of the Renaissance at least, it didn't have that collapse. So you can't talk about Renaissance only for the West, because that it's in there that allegedly the classical legacy was lost, which is not true, by the way, in strictly historical terms. I'm trying just to make you understand why we talk about the Renaissance. Because at a certain point, the narrative is that the classical legacy re-emerged. So you could have not talked about a Byzantine Renaissance, because the idea was that from that specific culture, if it had been really the Eastern Romans to write our own history, let's just imagine that the Byzantine Empire had not ended and now it would have been a major historiographical source. They would have never stressed the concept of Renaissance, because from their own perspective there was no fracture. There had been no fracture with the classical legacy. Because what's the Byzantines thought? Nothing had ever changed. That's incidentally a concept that you find still in prominently and not surprisingly in Greek nationalism. That they really believed that there is this enormous and grotesque emphasis on the continuity, as if nobody had ever changed, not just from Roman times, but from classical Hellenic times in there, because everything was, there was some conqueror, but those were not really important. The important is that we remained always the same way, and this is simply the product, also in great part, of what was built ideologically into the Byzantine, let's say in the medieval Roman Empire. And that is a legacy that goes on. So in that specific context, admitting a Renaissance would be to admit a fracture, a discontinuity. Instead, the Westerners had really no problem with that, because they were kind of more pragmatically oriented, and they had even the honesty of saying, a lot of it has changed. Even though, if you look at medieval history, even in the West, there has not been a single moment from which the Westerners have driven away from the classical legacy. Throughout all the Middle Ages in the West, there were those classical authors that were being studied and read, that were the basis of the, at least of the scientific knowledge broadly meant. So, and this is also a great difference that, however, exists, in my opinion, between the West and especially the Roman East, is that the Roman East was much more influenced by an Hellenic mindset that basically was in love with itself, for which the Greeks had theoretically invented the best possible imaginable world. They were the most advanced, that they had figured out all, they had found the perfect life of society, the perfect society, the perfect institutions, and they basically denied any form of change. I mean, even with the Greeks, even when they were conquered by the Romans, they kept thinking from their own perspective that basically nobody had really conquered them, that Rome was somewhere else, and that they were kind of on their own. You know, they have kind of this monastic view of themselves, whereas in the West, there was a very strongly pragmatic and not at all closed mindset that was the one that actually granted the Romans to create the empire that eventually the Hellenistic East kind of inherited eventually in early medieval times, for which the Romans had said, okay, we are Romans. And the Romans believed in themselves they were kind of an elect people, much more than the Greeks did. I mean, the Greeks were more in love with their thoughts and their intellectual activity. The Romans were in love with themselves as a people, as a stock, as a race, if you want, broadly meant, of course. They were the new chosen people, like the Jews. After them, they were essentially the ones who believed really to be the chosen ones. And indeed, they understood this also because they had conquered the empire. I mean, no other entity had lived so long. And the reason why a Roman Empire existed in the first place is that it was able to, and for so long, is that it was able to open to other cultures, open to different perspectives, open to different views. And in my opinion, this Latin legacy is the one that made the Westerners more pragmatically oriented over the Easterners at that point. And that's why in the political fragmentation of Latin Germanic Europe and everything, still Western Europe emerged as a kind of a leading expansive force that was able basically to engulf the world, even the same Byzantine Empire, to overcome it and to develop into what was eventually, in fact, the Renaissance, the modern age, etc., up to our days. This is very important as an interpretation because the same idea of Renaissance, in this sense, it kind of stresses the importance of the implicit, I mean, of all the stupid prejudices, especially towards the Middle Ages as such, in the same invention of the term, but it stresses the ability of the West to say, okay, there was we acknowledge that there was something wrong at some point. This is also a very important awareness, because if you reason like a Byzantine, your idea would have been essentially nothing changed. And you say, well, okay, but you've been conquered by the Crusaders, then by the Ottomans. Yeah, but nothing changed. So this is kind of a pretty crystallized thought that can be definitely it has its pros, definitely, because it stresses the importance of a tradition, of a belief, of a set of values, but at the same time that intellectual dynamism, that open-mindedness, that malleability that had distinguished the Romans and the same Byzantines initially for several centuries now died out. They basically transformed into their culture in a tunnel vision fashion, and they lost it, while the West was able to think about itself in critical terms, and that's very important, historically speaking. It's very important that we acknowledge we had a Renaissance. Now, the side effect was that, the Middle Ages were sacrificed on the altar of the progress, for which, those were the rubbish we mistook. But that's also, in fact, in my opinion, denigrating the Middle Ages is a denial of Western values. Because now I don't want to get nor political nor religious, but objectively, most of the values that are at the core of Western civilization were developed in medieval times. And even though, you can argue that it already existed partly before, but in the Middle Ages they were systematized. I don't know whether this term exists in English. They were kind of reframed and and most of what we deem as modern actually was something extremely close to medieval times. I mean, even consider it from a sheer chronological point of view. I mean, medieval times lasted 1,000 years. The modern age lasted essentially neither 300 years. So at that point, you realize that it wasn't even such a long time, and that most of what was formulated into the modern times was already based before. Even if you want to look at the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, you take the 18th century. As we have said, that's 1 century versus basically 13th that came before, or actually 12th, that had left a massive legacy, and you can't pretend to explain the Enlightenment if you really don't understand what the hell that word really was in many ways before. And it's not really a matter of opinion. I mean, study what, I don't know, the founding fathers of the United States studied and read. Study what even the very different French Enlightenment was really about. What was the intellectual education of people like Voltaire or Rousseau. Radically different views sometimes, but we're essentially looking at a past that was still cultural character was deeply rooted, also partly into the world that perhaps the Enlightenment was the moment of bitterest critique towards medieval times, indeed, and that's where we still feel this kind of bitter taste of the Middle Ages as the terrible, repulsive thing, because it's mostly a fault. It's not even because of the Renaissance; it's really because of the Enlightenment, in my opinion. But whatever. This would bring us very far. As for the Byzantine world, the term Renaissance wouldn't make sense because of the continuity. The same can go for the Asian world, because objectively the Asian cultures did really know a Middle Ages because they didn't feel really the impression to pass through an age of transition in which a great part of their civilization had fallen while another had to rise substantially. Also in here, I'm kind of ambivalent because I do think there is partly even something like that. I mean, if you look at the history of China, the Chinese Empire, the Han Empire, is objectively not that different from the Roman Principate. The thesis of continuity and discontinuity might not belong to these other cultures that are different from the Euro-Mediterranean one, but there is still a picture that can be drawn in similar terms. There is also a very important factor here to realize. It's also the scientific mindset. Because history, in fact, has not been conceived as a pure analytical reconstruction of facts, but as a sort of critical reflection on the past and the processes that have brought the dynamism of societies. Well, this is probably, in my opinion, not... This is a typically Western mindset, in my opinion. In the East, probably this is not really present. It's much different. But in my opinion, even certain perspectives on Asian history are not completely devoid of the Asian Middle Ages, let's say, medieval Asia, are not really wrong. And that's the reason why I also made some videos that are are called, like, I don't know, medieval Africa or medieval. I think I've done medieval India and medieval Southeast Asia, because I believe that objectively you can look at the Middle Ages in part of the Asian, the African, Asian, or even American and Oceanian Middle Ages in as such in some way. This actually gets very complicated for the Americas and even for Oceania. But if you look at North Africa, for instance, and even for Africa as the world, but definitely for North Africa and great parts of Asia, this is not completely wrong, in my opinion. And it can be really, Asian history in part can be interpreted in this way, but not so easily like for Western Europe, of course. It's much more complicated. And now I'm just approximating, but it's really, really complicated. It's really difficult to say such things. Another very interesting aspect of the way we conceive the Middle Ages is the usage of several. The idea that there has not been just one medieval time. There are many other Middle Ages in history. For instance, we talk about the Hellenic Middle Ages. So we're talking about that period that was essentially between the end of the Minoan Mycenaean culture and the beginning of, say, classical culture. So between the 12th and 10th century BC, or the Japanese Middle Ages, talking about the Sengoku period of the warring kingdoms, for instance, of the knights and heroes. So here instead we are between the 15th and the last fourth of the 16th century in Japan. But also in here, it's basically we Westerners taking this pattern of European history and applying it to other stories, also in very different fashion, because, for instance, what you notice in here is that these two Middle Ages we just mentioned lasted basically neither 2 centuries, while our Middle Ages lasted from the 5th to the 15th, so we are a whole millennium, so 5 times more. There is also another criterion that is looking at periods that are kind of similar to the Middle Ages themselves. For instance, I often trace, even before I did it, these analogies between the Middle Ages and great part of the modern age. And what I'm saying, it's not I'm stressing the continuity of these forms, but if you heard it, I conceptually say, okay, it's as if that part of the modern age had been like the Middle Ages, as if there had been a Middle Ages. So you see how we trick it, our mind to reason with these categories, with these concepts. It's very difficult to get rid of them. There is a whole branch. There is a whole branch of the academic world now that is developing these disciplines. Realizing how we are still using these categorical definitions that are practically impossible to support at the test of criticism, because they are just brutal approximations, and yet we use them because apparently this is however we naturally found it feasible at this point of our own civilization, our society, to explain the past and so on. And these criteria are based on kind of certain morphological similarities that exist, for instance, certain between the Middle Ages and certain other periods, either for institutional assets, for instance, feudalism, or military customs. So it's very interesting that we focus on this because in part, I think those are some of the most important indicators of a society overall. Feudalism, chivalry are, I often talk about them, for instance, when I talk about Persian history, because Persia has remained for most of its history kind of a feudal and chivalric-based country, in essence, especially during the medieval times. Objectively, Iran was a pretty feudal society. It was one of the really feudal societies, differently from other parts of the Middle and the Near East that were kind of similar, but were not so fully orientated on that feudal model that is very similar to one in Western Europe during the same period. But even for Europe, it's difficult to make this, because not everything was about feudalism or knights. How do you frame in this city republics of commoners, or I don't know, certain steppes peoples that were settled every once in a while in Eastern Europe? Those were kind of feudal in part. Even the Seljuk Turks, for instance, were during the Crusades were recognized by Western knights as kind of a similar, they had some similar feudal customs, certain military culture shared with the Crusaders in part. There is another perspective that lays into the concept of transition. Considering medieval times as a phase of a transition it's not really wrong, in my opinion, because probably the main problem is considering other ages as kind of stagnating or perfectly defined by something. When we think about the Middle Ages, we automatically think of this kind of not really. I'm sure many people think it as sort of a dark, stagnating pool where nothing interesting really happened. But I think even from those people's perspective, that was not such a idling place like, let's say, the ancient world or the modern age or the contemporary age, because for the same fact that, for instance, there was not a state, that there were so many wars in the mindset of these people, by the way, because wars have always been many in old times. It's as if that was a kind of an unstable period. So the idea of transition is very, very fitting for this view, but and emphasized for the Middle Ages, because the real mistake is considering other ages instead something solid and compact and immovable. When you think about the Roman Empire, what is that you think about? Essentially, you think about the early empire. Big, Romans walled cities with arenas and paved roads and aqueducts, and it's as if that was a model that lasted for unchanged, unmodified for such a long time that at a certain point, the barbarians arrived, razed everything to the ground, and the Middle Ages start. So inherently, even the start of the Middle Ages is considered as a moment of transition, as such. But I think that it is much more useful. It's actually fine to consider medieval times as a moment of transition, and it's very useful to consider every single time in history as a phase of transition, because every historical phase is by its nature a phase of transition. The mistake is considering the Greek and Roman and the modern civilizations as real civilizations, and medieval times something else we can't define. That's the real mistake. The Middle Ages were civilization, and they also were a great civilization in its own way. And generally speaking, there was no fracture, in the development of civilization in general, in human history. Everything has always kept evolving, and overall even improving. I personally believe that already from the 13th century, that is almost at the end of the Middle Ages. It is true, but Europe as a system medieval Europe as a system had surpassed Roman Europe. in terms of dynamism, potential, and so on. So it's not really also in here the idea that the Middle Ages were nothing like the ancient world, and only in the modern age, basically, European civilization recovered from the Middle Ages is completely stupid. Because the Middle Ages were really more advanced from a certain moment onwards than the ancient world. And I know there's plenty of people out there who believe that, I don't know, that before even the 18th century, Europe was nothing like the Roman Empire. This is pretty naive, and actually believe it lacks of any consistent evidence. Sometimes you find those weird graphs that pretend to explain on a scientific base how complex was, socially complex was the ancient world compared even to up to the 18th century, and claiming that, I don't know, for that reason, the Romans were more advanced than, everyone up to the 18th century. It's pretty stupid, and that's, in my opinion, not understanding even the ABC of things like history of technology, for instance, or, the history of whatever happened, but not just after the Roman Empire, but even of the Roman Empire itself. But it's full of these modernistic myths out there, sadly, and we still live into it at a point that is become even because you know what, it's these prejudices have become as a sort of pride of our own world in many ways. I mean, there are people who do not have intellectual tools to be actually appreciative and supportive of their own society without, blaming another one, like the medieval one, which reveals actual ignorance, because you basically create a fictitious enemy, a fictitious bad thing, and you basically compare yourself to it and you feel better about it. Well, if you really can see the progress that you can spot overall in our civilization, even through medieval times and up to now, basically it means you don't know nothing about history. And I don't want to push teleological views of conceptions of history at all. I mean, I think that civilization can go down, but I strongly believe that actually the point we got to represents an improvement. I mean, there is really nothing inherently better or worse than other times, but if you look at the, life quality, that's a pretty good indicator. And yeah, we don't live better than in Roman times. we don't live worse than in Roman times, or many survivalists would state that the hunter-gatherer society was the best one. I think they are overlooking so much, but also I want to go into depth now, maybe in another video. So the point I'm making is that in order to understand what we have today, you can't avoid to pass through the medieval times and say, wow, thanks Middle Ages. And I know it's very difficult for many to really acknowledge this, but it must be thought at a certain point, because otherwise you lose all. You can't understand the modern age without the Middle Ages. You can't understand the contemporary age without the modern ages. I argue that you can't even understand the ancient world without the Middle Ages, even if these came later. So what I'm guessing is that what I'm arguing is that if you stress certain comparisons or parallelisms, or you force this negative view of the medieval history, it's essentially because you don't know history in general. So naturally, the worst prejudice about medieval history looks at these centuries as a moment of decadence, of stasis, of barbarity. And all of these conceptions can be profitably criticized. There was no stasis. Start from decadence. Decadence, if it happened, it had mostly happened before, in late antiquity and early medieval times. Yeah, there was a moment of brusque contraction that usually fits into early medieval times proper, but this didn't last for more than a couple of centuries, of 10 out of 10 of medieval times. The rest was no decadence, was continuous growth. Even the 10th century, that is usually seen as this iron century of war and invasions, etc., as complexively as a system systematically was a moment of growth, of expansion. So this is false. So the medieval system was so evidently expansive that you can't even talk about stagnation, because there wasn't. I give you that from a sheer technological point of view. There was no real improvement of what was already known before. Many people say, oh well, there was a scientific revolution in the Middle Ages. I mean, few people who appreciate the Middle Ages. Well, this is not really true. There was a scientifical revival, in the sense, if you take science like for what it actually means etymologically, that is knowledge, meaning that indeed medieval times went ahead in terms of reinterpreting a certain ancient knowledge and enriching it and trying to systematize it, which is very important. In a way that went beyond actually what was being done in the ancient world, because it was framed to universalism, it was felt as a moral duty. Knowledge was a responsibility in the Middle Ages, something beautiful we should learn from the Middle Ages. Today we have knowledge, but we don't see it as a responsible anymore, or at least we don't really care. We don't really care to look at the world and say, okay, what I'm doing here, let's know more about it, because we can do better. This is what medievals believed, because they felt the moral duty, and in that case, because the world was conceived as a great symbol that God had created for mankind to decipher, and so on. But however, when you talk about strictly technological improvement, it is true there wasn't much of a technological improvement. I mean, there was a mechanical development. The Middle Ages are the civilization of the machines, really, and you can look at Gothic cathedrals and say, yeah, that's big. But if you look at the actual technology, you see that there wasn't a substantial improvement. It was really no new real scientific discovery. It was mostly a rediscovery and readaptation to those particular contexts. The only scientific field that apparently progressed was optics. This is true. A scientific improvement, technological improvement existed in that field in medieval times compared to the ancient world. But for the rest, everything was really kind of static in itself. And even you say, well, gunpowder, yeah, gunpowder, but you see how much it took for gunpowder actually to make a difference, even on the battlefields. It was a very slow process. There was definitely metallurgy was improved in medieval times, but it was nothing substantially different from what it existed before. It was kind of an improvement, and one that would make the difference in many ways. And therefore that's why I think Middle Ages were more advanced overall. But from a strictly scientific point of view, you don't find it. But overall, the system was expanding. You can't say it was stagnating. It was literally increasing in size. It was something massive, especially pre-Black Death. Europe was a monstrous system. It was extremely large, extremely big. The other prejudice about barbarity, it's probably the most stupid of all. First of all, you have to explain what does barbarity means. It's absurd in any way. The Middle Ages were quite humanistic in nature. I'm not talking about humanism that developed at the end of the Middle Ages. I'm talking about really the concept, mostly the Christian-derived conception. Every man was had a conscience that made it equal in front of God, at least. There was a substantial abolition of the concept of ancient slavery, because medieval serfdom, you can say, okay, that there was kind of slavery, but it was actually very different from the ancient one. There had been a substantial improvement. It was not just a matter of, of Christianity. It was really also related to other dynamics that existed in there, but those informed also, in fact, the ideologies and beliefs and so on. And it was a moment also of, what is barbarity? Once again, I don't know how I should respond to this. There was no barbarity proper. It was also a much more, if you assume barbarians are those who live in tribal societies, because that's it, well, of course, the Middle Ages were definitely much less barbaric than the ancient were. It's pretty self-evident. So really, no, these are stupid ideas about medieval times, and you can legitimately criticize them and not taking them seriously wherever you hear them. Another very stupid prejudice is that basically during the Middle Ages there was no way to rebuild effectively the fragments of the glory and the past glories in culture, for which we even decided to define to spot other smaller renaissances, let's say into the Middle Ages, like for instance the one of the Carolingian Renaissance, the Ottonian Renaissance, and the 12th century Renaissance, which are very humanistic in nature. I mean, they're not really, during these times weren't really great, as we've seen, technical improvements. As a matter of fact, in most of these Renaissance, especially the Carolingian one, there wasn't really any even improvement of the living condition of the average people. There was simply a society that was now increasingly more structured, so most of the freemen had lost their freedom. In fact, even if they were juridically freemen, they were now being framed into as peasants, as serfs, into this growing feudal system. But hey, yeah, the Carolingian court produced kind of international culture. It spread literacy. It spread this uniform character, this uniform writing. And yeah, that was a pretty massive legacy. Actually, it's often overlooked, but generally speaking, even here, what's really the Renaissance in itself? Renaissance, even the canonic Renaissance, shouldn't be understood like an actual improvement of living condition, because this is how we usually interpret it. It was really like a moment of, the Renaissance equates to better quality of life. No, most of the times actually wasn't true. The quality of life sometimes was better in early medieval times than in late medieval times, especially in the peasantry, seemingly. It's very complicated now to scope, but let's say that different times and different spaces had different stories. And we should go into detail to each one of them to really understand what it really was. Another very deeply rooted prejudices about medieval times is that it was basically the age of superstition. An age of superstition dominated by the hegemony of the church. So first of all, superstition was something that was condemned since Roman times, and it passed into the Christian mindset as well. I mean, the superstition is something church has always kind of fought against, because basically there were these other beliefs and magical, magics, witchery, stuff like that were already outlawed in pagan Roman times. So the myth that paganism was also tolerant and everything was accepted is completely false. Where the Romans distinguished between licit and illicit cults. In the latter, also Christianity had fit initially. But Christianity kind of got it back, because the idea was that now the superstition was tied to this reminiscence of pagan beliefs that still existed and were pretty much alive, also especially in the country areas for most of the Middle Ages. So even this concept that the Christian faith is kind of superstition is an Enlightenment prejudice. In the Renaissance, this was not believed, for instance, because the Renaissance was Christian. So also this is, the hegemony of the church is also very debatable. It's debatable because first of all, a substantial part of medieval times were pagan still. Secondly, as we've seen, these beliefs were not really completely erased, and also the actual coercive control, ideological control of the church was much less capillary than we usually think. Most of the ecclesiastical, most of the Christian repressions that were carried out in the Middle Ages were actually political and social in nature. If peasants still went to church, but by going to church they still believed in certain pagan stuff, that really the church was not really concerned, as long as the social order was maintained. And the social order was not controlled by the church directly. It was simply, at the time, state and church were virtually indistinguishable. So basically, it was the constitute order of kingdoms, of princedoms, of the empire that was there, and it was acting with the church, because everybody was technically Christian. So it was normal, even that it was such a thing. Of course, we can't cross out oppression in the process, but that was a time where there were no human rights, where nobody really knew about modern physics or something like. So it was inherently producing something like that, not because there was an oppression, but because society was oppressive in itself in many ways. Society is still oppressive in some ways. We're not completely free, but that's also a toll we have to pay to live into an organized society. And so it was into the medieval times. So the church at that point also did a freaking lot of positive things that today are, for most people, are still preferred to be fanatically forgotten because it doesn't fit with their own ideological narratives. Indeed, the church also stemmed, however, certain movements that were being born within the same church. Sometimes the Protestant historiography, also the Enlightenment, have created certain heroes of medieval times, like these characters that kind of oppose themselves to the hegemony of, especially of the Roman Church, as if they were free thinkers. These weren't at all free thinkers. First of all, they were all Christians. They were still, kind of intransigent towards other interpretations and so on, and just wanted to express their own because they thought that their own was right. And at that point, as we were saying, it's not the church was extremely concerned about this new ideas spreading, but mostly the way they were. These were bringing to a sort of secession from the Roman Church, or a questioning of its authority and so on. But we all know that even there has never been a moment in history into which Christian society was actually made up by people who truly understood the Bible, or it was just formal and ritualistic in many ways. So even this idea that the church controlled every single mind is actually very stupid. It's a myth invented, I believe, even in the 20th century. Because I don't think even the Enlightenment at the time had the the ideological conception that the church could really control everything. Because that sounds mostly like something you read from Nazi Germany of Soviet Russia, not really from a medieval institution that was pretty weak in nature, because centralization was really weak and the way of imposing means were very, very few. There is this other aspect of medieval times, this of warrior nobility that was very violent and over, aggressive. Yeah, this is partly true. I mean, at that time, definitely violence was a thing, and the aristocracies was usually a warrior class that lived, with a very strong, violent ethos, and which also, although Christian was pretty much still, in terms of military ethos, was still essentially pagan in nature, even if they didn't realize that these aristocracies stemmed in part also from these Germanic models. So it was not a matter of genetics, because medieval times were, there was no way to distinguish in medieval times a genetic belonging to nobility, but these people believed it was the case. But it was really the Germanic models there of violence that actually were at that point coupled also with certain interpretation of the scriptures that the Bible talks definitely a real lot about war in it, so that there was a lot to take from it as well. But also in here you have to think that it was really the whole society to be violent. Usually this idea of the oppressive hierarchies of the noblemen and of the church is a kind of a Marxist interpretation of history. It's the idea that they were the oppressed, the enslaved. If you look at the history of peasants during the Middle Ages, you realize how violent and aggressive they could really be as communities, how even free and dynamic they were, contrarily-wise to prejudice. Peasants were much more oppressed in the modern age than into the Middle Ages. It was a violent society as a whole, because there was no central authority who could impose public order effectively. So these people took matters in their own hands, definitely. But also in here, this was not anarchy. And I studied now from several years many sources about war, about politics, this stuff in the Middle Ages, and what you realize is just striking, is how much society was all blended in. I mean, the idea of the preeminence of aristocracy was definitely in part imposed, but it was really there was really no other way to make society work at that point. And the whole society revolved around this. The same feudal seigneury was born because there were freemen who were essentially asking for help from these warriors and say, okay, let's defend us, and we will pay for you. I don't know, think about the Seven Samurais. What's the same concept in the movie? I mean, there was a positivity in this organization, which means that the nobility was trying to expand its domains, and there was no need to oppress its own domains. And the same people who lived in there were happy of these noblemen expanding into other against other seigneuries, so intrinsically committing violence against others, but at the same time, kind of earning something from it in turn. And as we know, the feudal elite dominated Europe, but not also in absolute terms, not hegemonically for a very long time. There were also other classes that rose, that exercised violence as much as the feudal nobility. So it's kind of senseless. On the other hand, I've found certain apologists who say that basically Christian knights were so pious-souled that didn't touch anyone. Well, no, we have extensive evidence that all warriors, it doesn't matter whether they were Christian or pagan or wherever they came from, were Muslim, etc., they all committed the worst kind of atrocities ever. Slaughters, rapes, we're talking about butchered children and every kind of thing you can imagine, every kind of extreme violence you can imagine. So you can argue that at this point the only discriminant factor is how centralized was society. I mean, how much these guys at the top could enforce public order that was functional for trade, for economy to develop, because you can't trade and prosper into an unpacified society. So you can say on average that, I don't know, Anglo-Saxon England was kind of more civilized than Viking Scandinavia. Yes, generally speaking, yes. There were still, two extremely violent worlds, but at the same time, where there was a more structured state, you find generally speaking, a better living condition, and a generally also less violence. But generally speaking, yeah, this was overall a very violent time. However, it was not particularly more or less violent than the ancient world and modern age. Also because wars, the more states are advanced, the more wars become devastating in many ways, the more also this has an impact on society. So this is very relative. It really depends also which kind of violence. Surely this was a kind of an abusive society. Definitely, even if you read witnesses of how the peasantry lived up to a few centuries ago, these were terrible places to live in many ways. So it was not a pink picture of the world. Definitely, it was a pretty tough world in many ways, and mostly probably from a psychological rather than strictly physical point of view, even though, living at that time was also physically extremely tough. Another prejudice stands in also in the ignorance of the poor plebs. Yeah, of course, yeah. We dedicated, I think, not a video, but yeah, I discussed about literacy, education, especially in early medieval Europe. And yes, it is true. The Middle Ages were kind of a mostly illiterate world, and there's not much that can be told. But at the same time, it was, at a structural level, it was not an illiterate world in the sense that the education systems were always out there. Saying Christianity as a religion of the book was spreading literacy. Everywhere evangelization arrived, people began to read substantially. At least there was an elite that could do it and could organize society. And so this idea that medieval times wake up intellectually only in the Renaissance is completely stupid. Everybody who has studied paleography or codicology knows perfectly that medieval times produced an enormous quantity of written material, and there was a great philosophical and literary development, and actually, at least if you take 14th century Florence, you have already the same levels of literacy of Antonine Rome. Also in here, it really depends also because literacy is not of just one type, but generally speaking, the picture was not completely dark. Naturally, for our own standards today, of course, that was a pretty ignorant and illiterate society, but even the modern one was, or even the there was an improvement, but still, for our standards, many things can really be pretty lame already from, if you look back in a few decades, if you want. So the important here is that the Middle Ages were not intellectually idling at all. And this is a vision, in fact, that paradoxically we can confute because it started from the same medieval times. Because it is true that this picture of the Middle Ages was drawn roughly from the 15th and 16th century, but the prodromes can be spotted already into the 14th century. If you take Petrarca, for instance, well, you see in there that he was recognized as a literate man, as a person who was extremely cultured, and that, culture was better, and that the time where he was living were kind of underdeveloped from this point of view. But mostly this perception actually spread in the Enlightenment, because it was the Enlightenment that stressed, the idea of the civilization of light, the idea that you have to read, and that's simply because in the Enlightenment there was an ever sharper contrast between the elites and those who couldn't access to certain rights of also education and so on. So the Enlightenment was stressing pretty much this exclusivism of its own society that actually was projected into medieval times. While medieval times were actually much less biased. I mean, in medieval times, if you were kind of a gifted person, you could, intellectually speaking, you could hope to make a career somewhat, even if you came from a very poor family and so on. Virtually everybody could go to school if they wanted. I mean, nobody did because people were, if everybody had gone to school, the whole society would have starved to death because, the economy was at a survival rate. So that was the implicit reason why it was not possible. But I mean, in the Middle Ages, in the church schools and eventually in the lay schools, everybody was virtually accepted. Was no real impediment, and if you were smart enough, that was really the criterion to which you had to go on. And this was the same also in the ancient world, by the way. So also Roman literacy was not something, like modern schools where all the children go there and know how to read perfectly and count. No. The majority just knew how to read and to write something, and that's it. It was only the most gifted that went on and were selected in this fashion to eventually enter into the public administration. And the Middle Ages was a bit like this. If not for the fact that there was, in addition, a great quantity of people went, basically, think about all the monks at that point. That it was a life of studies. For many of them, at least. So it was purely contemplative, it was purely intellectual in many ways. Although even in medieval times there was a very pragmatically oriented view of education. In the 13th, 14th century you have the creation of essentially modern bureaucracy. I mean, if you look at the Angevin or papal bureaucracy in Avignon, you realize that that's objectively what bureaucracy emerged in a structured fashion in the West. For not talking about Constantinople, especially in the church, where the Church of Constantinople had so many possessions, so many properties, that they had already developed an incredibly developed administration that was unmatched essentially until the modern age as well. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And the sharpest criticism, in fact, towards the medieval levels of literacy appear in the Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, and in the Essai des Mœurs of Voltaire. So those are the works in which you find the greatest criticism in general, because those guys were essentially picturing medieval times like the ones we're seeing now. I mean, this in their time. So with the Ancien Regime, that kind of kept a great part of people oppressed in some way. So that's where basically our roots in the way of thinking the Middle Ages stem. Even unconsciously, when we end up to attribute to the Middle Ages all the possible barbarities of history, as if it was an alibi for all the other periods. So there is this black legend of the Middle Ages, was conceived by the Enlightenment, that instead was opposed eventually polemically by the Golden Legend of the Middle Ages, how it was in a way it had been imagined by the first Romantic authors, that were stressing instead other qualities, medieval times. So the sincere religious faith and the pure heroism and this artistic spontaneity, poetical spontaneity as well. So basically, it was a prejudice opposing another prejudice, and not really looking at the historical evidence for what it, from an attentively unprejudiced way. And as we were saying before, the really disconcerting problem at this point is that we still, in the West, we didn't get rid of this vexata questia in many ways. So this debate about, there has never been a real debate about Middle Ages. I mean, in the academies, of course, we discuss this endlessly, but also we go so much in depth that we lack the overall picture of the thing. And in our societies, it doesn't seem that the Middle Ages have been really considered seriously. I mean, even if you look at the mass media, you see that the Middle Ages pop out continuously. Really, people are attracted towards the Middle Ages in many ways. If you look at cinema, even certain literary bestsellers, or even certain role games and video games, they even in certain neo-pagan religions that are kind of out there, you realize this. There's new age fashion that brings certain mythopoetical or aesthetical elements back into our perception of medieval times, but nevertheless these seem to have been all kind of useless in many ways. I'm personally extremely critical of all of these revivals, because they of course, in part I think they are useful. I think it's perfectly fine, especially when there is the spontaneity of saying, okay, let's talk about the Middle Ages, or at least let's do something that brings people closer to the Middle Ages. So every initiative is kind of cool. But it's as if even in these initiatives there was no real historical interest, really. For all these medieval fairs of people who come out there just to eat or drink, with guys and girls dressed up in medieval fashion. Is that really a way to teach history? Is that really a way to look at medieval times seriously? Because it's apart from the fact that this is a sum of cliches most of the times, even in video games, in movies, and so on. People seem to really lack the point. I mean, people seem to be attracted by the idea we have the Middle Ages, not by their historical nature. I mean, many people who watch even certain fictions that have come out there, they don't really care about medieval history after all. They just care about something that looks cool and saying, oh wow, this is how the Middle Ages. But it's a worldview that an 18 years old at best can have. There is no leap forward in the real construction of historical awareness that can look at the Middle Ages saying, okay, let's look at them for what they without these filters, in fact, that we were talking about before. But that's the problem. Until you don't see beyond the filter, you can't even realize that you have filters on. That's really the worst of our museological dramas, let's say. So, and in general, every medieval revival at this point seems rather episodical and contingential. I mean, there is no systematicity, there is no seriality into this. It seems like It's just something fashionable and cool that every once in a while pops out, but yeah, it ends there. For instance, there is a bit more of this dialogue we are having. For instance, in schools. I mean, when I went to school, actually our teachers didn't put a big emphasis on these problems. Now that I think about it, so I even remember perhaps some kind of cliche about medieval, but perhaps not so much. But the general story is that basically, around the 5th century, there's the structuration of the Roman state. There are so many paradoxes. If you want, you can see both things. For instance, in the 5th century, you have the structuration of the Roman state, but in the 13th and from the 13th to the 15th century, you find the premises of the modern state being formed. On Schwerpunkt, we discussed the structuration of, and we will keep talking about the structuration of feudal monarchies of the 13th century, especially state and something like that. So if you're interested, you can check it out. There is also this phase of endemic rarefaction and the increase of rural and forestal life between the 6th and the 10th century, but at the same time you find also this extremely intense phases of urban development in Europe between the 11th and the 13th century. And there are also many other phases of stagnation, and together with other phases of growth, like the 11th century, or involutional transformations like in the 14th century, the major crisis we discussed really frequently on Schwerpunkt. That's a really important turning point, I must say. There is a term of revolution that comes into place. Before I was saying there was no real revolution in the Middle Ages. Yeah, because revolution is a bad word in general. I use the term revolution only when it's a historiographical it's a macroscopical thing, like, I don't know, the French Revolution or the American Revolution. You realize that's the historical name. We all know what it means. It's fine. And it's like when you say Byzantine, you actually don't think it means anything, but at least we all know what we are talking about in a way or another. So it's also interesting to see how symbols and semantics really work. But there is a sort of intellectual revolution between the 12th and 13th century. There is also an enormous trade expansion in the 13th. These are all topics I discussed on Schwerpunkt. If you go into the playlist Medieval Society especially, you will find all of these topics discussed, and we will keep discussing them in the future. So I'm just advising you so that if you're interested, you know where to find. Another topic that we have touched relatively recently in this video called, if you give me a second, periodizing the Middle Ages. I made a bit more than 1 month ago. We can sum up a little bit how it is, but I discuss essentially all of these topics of the periodization of medieval times. It has kind of a pretty hefty video, but I think it's interesting enough. So we need, obviously, looking at this enormous mass of medieval times, we have to necessarily periodize into smaller chunks. So here, really, every school, every country kind of has a different idea. There is the idea of the early or high Middle Ages, depending also in here for which country. You say it's this phase between the 5th to the 10th century, then the low Middle Ages between the 11th to the 15th. In the German world, usually the German world, that it was a bit of a it was the leading romantic country in the 19th century, and it was probably the country that looked more in depth at the Middle Ages and kind of gave a more articulated subdivision in, let's say, high Middle Ages from the 5th to the 9th, then middle or full Middle Ages between the 10th and the 13th, and late Middle Ages between the 14th and the 15th. And this is the same repetition I prefer. But all of these subdivisions seem to be kind of insufficient, because they're still too kind of, first of all, they're not universal. So sometimes we talk about these things even when we go abroad. We talk with foreign people, and they have different periodizations, so it's a bit machinose in itself. It's most self-referential to national historiographies. But in general, they're still wild approximations, because we're talking about chunks of centuries and 1,000 years, like split in 2 or 3. It can be useful, but you have to be, what's the point sometimes? So when does the Middle Ages end? It's usually, we think about the 15th century with the discovery of the Americas, Christopher Columbus, and this essentially finding out that across the Atlantic Sea there was another world. So this was a pretty big thing at the time, because we like to stress that this kind of destroyed the certainties of a millenary cosmography. But at the time, really the biggest impact was probably the Reformation, because even the cosmographical ideas had really been, in medieval times, not pretty much homogeneous. I mean, even the myth that medievals believed that the earth was flat is kind of false. Many times in Middle Ages, actually, it was this idea that the earth was round. But probably that was not so enormously important after all. It was mostly even cartography was not particularly developed. There was not a real interest to know how the thing really was. There were many theories. People will wonder about this, but in the practice, this had still not been a thing. It was mostly the relation with different populations that made the difference. People looked at the Bible and said, okay, what are these? Where are they? We're looking at creation, the spread of mankind eventually to the world. Everything had to fit more or less into this biblical view. There is a tendency, I think, recently to anticipate the end of medieval times, or at least it's a very it's fascinating as a perception, although I don't fully share it. But the idea is that basically the mid-14th century was the end of the Middle Ages, chiefly because of this demographical and socio-economical collapse, after which Europe really transforms itself very, very deeply. Just the other day I made a video about Black Death. That is the main, but also in there were several factors that contributed to this. Other people instead want to stress, and towards this option, this view, I have several doubts, because with the same criteria, I mean, it's a very structuralist interpretation. On ideological basis, you could shift this even to the mid-13th century by certain standards, or it really depends. But also, you wonder what's the point. Other authors say that basically the Middle Ages go on until the end of until the beginning of industrial society. So basically, with the great revolutions of the end of the 18th century. So this is the thesis of the long Middle Ages that also goes kind of beyond. And it has fascinated, especially the French school, the so-called Nouvelle Histoire, because probably in here there is this French perspective that has been influenced by the same French Revolution that basically looked at the Ancien Régime and its society as a direct continuation of medieval society, and therefore it's stressed, especially from this point of view. For other countries, it's evidently there are different experiences, there are different perceptions, but it's still interesting nevertheless, and it's also not devoid of truth, because objectively that has not to do with France. Objectively, but the Industrial Revolution changed a freaking lot in all the countries. Also, different countries had different stages in this evolution, but overall, there is a big difference between pre-industrial and industrial societies. So, but at that point also, where does this mostly points at the problem of the end of the Middle Ages? It doesn't really deal with the beginning of the Middle Ages, because if the criterion is pre-industrial society, it's basically all human history before the Industrial Revolution, which is a bit. This has nothing to do with the Middle Ages at this point. So, as long as you take these proposals as conventions, as approximation, everything is really fine. Every kind of historical periodization has this limit. And however, what is perhaps more interesting about this historiographical perspective is not really the mind game you can make with them, but it's really about how the society who produces such periodization reasons. I mean, true, if you study the history of historiography, you can objectively understand much of how certain societies were through their view of the past and of history in general. So probably that's the most important thing that these repetitions really work for. So it's a very good exercise to concentrate on certain perceptions of history, to understand what the people who thought them were believing, and what we still do, because in fact we do have these views, and it's difficult to reason, especially from the within. It's much easier to look at it from the external point of view. And also we have this automatic feel that if someone is older than us, we can look at him from the above, well, it should be really the other way around, and therefore it's easier for us, however, to criticize, while it's very difficult for us to criticize ourselves and to say, okay, why do we think objectively these things? And I believe that most people really know the answer if only this answer was asked. So also here the problem is not really not knowing the answer, it's really not posing the question. And that's perhaps the most important point in history. Posing questions, because until you don't pose questions, people leave as if those didn't matter, or as if they knew the answer, but they evidently don't most of the times. Or I mean they know it, but they're not willing to admit it, maybe. And that's even worse, naturally. So yeah, that's more or less what I wanted to say, and let's stop it to this, and we will definitely talk about the periodization of medieval times in another moment. And or at least we will re-talk about that, because it's still important to discuss it. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.